The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering pines when Jeremiah Big Jack Sullivan heard the crying. He'd been working these Oregon forests for nigh on 15 years, and never once had he heard such a sound echoing through the timber. His massive frame, 6'4" and built like the Douglas firs he felled, froze mid-swing, the double-bit axe suspended in calloused hands that could split a man's skull as easy as kindling. The crying came again, thin and desperate, like a wounded animal, but unmistakably human. Jack set down his axe and followed the sound deeper into the grove, his heavy boots crushing the carpet of pine needles beneath him. The Oregon Territory in 1873 was still wild country, where a man might go weeks without seeing another soul, where wolves and bears outnumbered settlers 10 to 1. But this was no wolf pup he found nestled in the hollow of an ancient oak. The baby couldn't have been more than a year old, wrapped in what had once been fine cloth, silk by the look of it, though now torn and stained with forest mud. Her hair was black as coal, her skin the color of rich earth, and her eyes, Lord help him, those eyes were the deepest brown he'd ever seen, holding an intelligence that seemed far too old for such a small face. Jack looked around the clearing, expecting to see signs of whoever had left her, but there were no tracks save his own, no indication of how a baby in silk wrappings had come to be tucked inside a tree trunk 20 miles from the nearest settlement. The child reached up to him with tiny fingers, and something in his chest, a part that had been cold and empty since his Sarah died 3 winters past, suddenly warmed. "Well now, little one," he murmured, his voice rough from years of calling timber. "Seems like you're in a heap of trouble, ain't you?" He gathered her up, marveling at how light she felt in his arms. The nearest town was Millbrook, half a day's ride through terrain that would challenge a seasoned mountain man. But Jack had built his cabin with his own hands, stocked it with provisions to last through the harsh Oregon winters. He could care for a child, at least until he figured out where she belonged. "Reckon I'll call you Grace," he said, looking down at her peaceful face, "on account of you being God's grace sent to an old fool who'd forgotten what it meant to have family." The years that followed tested every fiber of Jack's being. Raising a child in the wilderness was work that would have broken lesser men, but Jack Sullivan had never backed down from a challenge in his life. He learned to prepare bottles from goat's milk, to fashion toys from wood scraps, to sing lullabies in a voice that had previously known only work songs and the occasional curse. Grace grew like a wildflower, hardy, resilient, and beautiful in a way that made grown men stop and stare when Jack brought her to town for supplies. By age 5, she could track a deer through underbrush, identify edible plants, and start a fire with flint and steel. By 10, she was helping Jack with the smaller timber, her movements graceful and sure despite her youth. But it was her way with people that truly set her apart. When the circuit preacher came through Millbrook, Grace would listen to his sermons with an intensity that unnerved the old man. When traveling merchants passed through their territory, she would watch them with those penetrating dark eyes, as if reading their souls. And when trouble came to the mountains, as it always did in those days, Grace seemed to know about it before anyone else. The first real sign that something was different about his adopted daughter came when Grace turned 16. Jack had ridden into Millbrook for supplies, leaving her at the cabin as he'd done countless times before. When he returned, he found her sitting on the porch with a stranger, a well-dressed Mexican gentleman who seemed far too refined for the rough Oregon frontier. "Papa," Grace said, using the name she'd called him since she first learned to speak, "this is Señor Mendoza. He's been waiting for you."
Jack's hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45 on his hip. In his experience, strangers who sought out men in the wilderness rarely brought good news. Mendoza was a small man, perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and clothes that spoke of considerable wealth. His horse was a magnificent stallion that must have cost more than most men earned in a year. "Senor Sullivan," Mendoza said, rising from his chair with obvious respect, "I have traveled a very long way to speak with you about the young lady you have raised." "Have you now?" Jack's voice carried the low rumble of distant thunder. "And what business might that be?" Mendoza's eyes shifted to Grace, who sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "Anything you gotta say, you can say in front of Grace. She's got a right to hear it." The Mexican gentleman nodded slowly. "Very well. Senor Sullivan, the young woman you know as Grace is, how do you say, not what she appears to be." Jack's jaw tightened. "She's my daughter. That's all the appearing I need to know about." "Yes, I can see that you love her deeply. But Grace, the name is appropriate, for she has indeed been God's grace. She is not merely an abandoned child you found in the forest. She is Esperanza Alejandra Vasquez Montalvo, the daughter of Don Carlos Vasquez Montalvo, one of the wealthiest landowners in California. She is also the granddaughter of Chief Red Cloud of the Lakota Sioux." The words hit Jack like an axe blow to the chest. He looked at Grace, searching her face for some sign of surprise, but found only a quiet sadness that suggested she had known this moment would come. "That's impossible," Jack said. "I found her abandoned in a tree." "No, senor. You found her hidden in a tree by her mother, my niece Maria, who was fleeing for her life. Maria was the daughter of Don Carlos and a Lakota woman named Morning Star. When Maria married against her father's wishes and bore a child of mixed blood, powerful men wanted them both dead. The child you found was not abandoned, she was saved." Grace finally spoke, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being revealed. "I've known for years, Papa. Not the details, but I've always known I was different. The way people looked at me, the dreams I had of other places, other people. And lately," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "lately I've been having visions of a man in chains, calling my name." Jack felt the world shifting beneath him like a landslide. What kind of visions? Dark places, men with badges and guns, and always the same voice calling for Esperanza. She looked at Mendoza. "My father?" The Mexican nodded gravely. "Don Carlos is dying, child. He has spent 17 years searching for you, trying to make amends for the choices that forced your mother to flee. He is imprisoned in Monterrey, falsely accused of crimes he did not commit. His enemies seek to steal his lands, but they cannot act fully while his heir lives. They believe you are dead." "But I ain't dead," Grace said, and for the first time, Jack heard something hard and dangerous in her voice. "And I ain't Esperanza. I'm Grace Sullivan, daughter of Big Jack Sullivan of the Oregon Territory." Mendoza spread his hands apologetically. "That may be who you choose to be, señorita, but your bloodline carries responsibilities. Your grandfather, Don Carlos, controls nearly 100,000 acres of the finest grazing land in California. Your great-grandfather, Red Cloud, still holds influence among the Plains tribes. You are the bridge between two worlds, the key to peace between peoples who have known only war." Jack had heard enough. "Mister, I don't care if she's the daughter of President Grant himself. Grace is my child, and she ain't going nowhere she doesn't want to go." "Papa," Grace's voice was soft but firm, "I have to know. All these years I felt like something was missing, like I was only half of who I was supposed to be. Maybe this is why." "Grace, honey, you don't owe nobody nothing. You're perfect just as you are." She stood and walked to him, placing her small hands on his massive arms. "You gave me everything, Papa. You gave me love and strength and the knowledge that I could survive anything. But you also taught me that a person has to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Jack looked into those deep brown eyes that had watched him with such love for 16 years and saw the woman she had become. Strong, determined, and ready to face whatever destiny awaited her. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he nodded. "Then I reckon we'd better go to California." Part 2 began with the most difficult journey of Jack Sullivan's life, and it had nothing to do with the treacherous mountain passes or the armed men who seemed to shadow their trail from the moment they left Oregon. The hardest part was watching Grace transform before his eyes, shedding the simple frontier girl he'd raised and revealing glimpses of the noble woman she'd been born to be. Mendoza proved to be both guide and teacher during their 3-week journey south. He spoke to Grace in Spanish, teaching her the formal phrases of her heritage, explaining the intricate politics of California's great ranches, and preparing her for a world Jack barely understood. At night, around their campfires, the Mexican gentleman would tell stories of her parents, how Maria Vasquez Montalvo had defied convention to marry a half-Lakota trader named Joseph Standing Bear, how their love had scandalized both the Spanish aristocracy and the tribal councils, and how their enemies had used that scandal to destroy them. "Your father was not a weak man," Mendoza explained one evening as they camped in the shadow of Mount Shasta. "Joseph Standing Bear had fought alongside Red Cloud in the wars against the army. But when the hired killers came for your mother, he was away trading horses. Maria barely escaped with you, riding through the night to reach the Oregon forests where she knew her husband had once lived. She hid you in that tree and drew the killers away, leading them into the mountains where they found only her body." Grace absorbed these stories with the same intensity she'd once brought to learning how to read animal tracks. But Jack could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of understanding that her very existence had cost her parents their lives. "What about the grandfather?" Jack asked. "This Don Carlos fella, why didn't he protect his own daughter?" Mendoza's face darkened. "Pride, senor. Foolish, stubborn pride. Don Carlos had arranged a marriage for Maria with the son of another great family. When she chose love over duty, he disowned her. By the time he realized his mistake, by the time he understood that his enemies were using his anger against him, it was too late." They reached the outskirts of Monterey on a foggy morning that seemed to mirror Jack's mood. The town was larger than any place Grace had ever seen, with adobe buildings that spoke of Spanish colonial wealth and newer wooden structures that showed American expansion. But Jack's attention was drawn to the fortress-like jail that dominated the central plaza, a grim stone building surrounded by guards who wore the badges of county sheriffs but carried themselves like hired guns. "That's where they're holding Don Carlos," Mendoza said quietly. "The charges are cattle rustling and murder, but everyone knows they're false. His enemies control the sheriff, the judge, even the territorial governor. They plan to hang him next week, then divide his lands among themselves." Grace stared at the jail with an expression Jack had never seen before, a mixture of determination and calculation that reminded him powerfully of her mother's eyes in the stories Mendoza told. "How many men are guarding him?" "Too many for a direct assault," Mendoza replied, "but there may be another way. The town council is meeting tomorrow to hear appeals for clemency. If you were to appear as Esperanza Vasquez Montalvo, the rightful heir—" "They'd probably just arrest her, too," Jack interrupted. "These men have killed to get this far. They ain't gonna let some girls stand in their way." "Perhaps not," Mendoza agreed, "but they would have to acknowledge her claim publicly. And there are still people in this town who remember the old days, who respected Don Carlos before his enemies turned the law against him. If Esperanza could prove her identity, rally those supporters." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying the jail and the men around it. Finally, she spoke. "What would I need to prove who I am?" Mendoza reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he pulled a silver pendant on a delicate chain, a cross inlaid with turquoise in the Lakota tradition. "This belonged to your mother. Don Carlos has its match. But more than that, you have her face, her gestures, and—" he hesitated. "There is a birthmark, here." He touched the base of his neck, shaped like a crescent moon. Both Maria and her father bore the same mark. Without a word, Grace pulled aside the collar of her shirt, revealing the small crescent-shaped mark Jack had noticed countless times over the years, but never thought significant. Mendoza's breath caught. Dios mío, you are truly her daughter. That evening, they took rooms at the town's only decent hotel, a 2-story building that catered to wealthy ranchers and traveling businessmen. Jack felt out of place among the well-dressed clientele, but Grace moved through the lobby with a natural grace that drew respectful nods from men who would have dismissed a simple frontier girl. Their plans were interrupted by a knock at Jack's door near midnight. He opened it to find a nervous-looking young man in a clerk's vest. "Señor Sullivan, my name is Miguel Santos. I work at the courthouse. Señor Mendoza said you might be willing to pay for information." Jack let him in, noting the way the young man's hands shook as he spoke. "What kind of information?" "About Don Carlos, about tomorrow's hearing." Miguel glanced around nervously. "There will be no clemency. Judge Harrington has already written the death warrant. But that's not the worst of it. They know about the girl." Jack's blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "Sheriff Morrison has men watching the hotel. They know Esperanza has returned. They're planning to arrest her the moment she appears at the courthouse." From the connecting door came Grace's voice. "Then we'll have to make sure I don't appear as expected."
She stepped into the room, and Jack was startled by her transformation. Gone was the simple frontier dress she'd worn for their journey. Instead, she wore a black silk gown that Mendoza must have procured, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of Spanish aristocracy. But more than her clothes had changed, her entire bearing was different, regal and commanding in a way that made Miguel step back in respect. "Señorita," Miguel stammered, "they will be looking for you." "Yes," Grace said calmly, "but they'll be looking for a frightened girl trying to save her grandfather. They won't be expecting what I actually intend to give them." Jack felt a chill of premonition. "Grace, what are you planning?" She turned to him with a smile that was both loving and absolutely determined. "I'm planning to be exactly who I was born to be, Papa. And tomorrow, this town is going to learn what that means." The next morning brought fog so thick it seemed to muffle the very sounds of the town. Grace stood before the mirror in her hotel room, putting the finishing touches on her appearance. The black silk dress was elegant but severe, and the silver pendant bearing her mother's cross caught the lamplight. She looked every inch the Spanish noblewoman, but Jack could see the steel beneath the silk. "You don't have to do this," he said for the 10th time. "We could ride out right now, head back to Oregon where you're safe." "Papa." Grace's voice was patient but firm. "Would you have ridden away if someone had imprisoned your father on false charges? That's different. I'm a man, and I know how to handle myself in a fight." "So do I. You taught me." She turned from the mirror to face him. "You taught me to shoot straight, to think clearly under pressure, and never to back down from doing what's right. Did you think I'd forget all that just because I put on a fancy dress?" Jack realized with a mixture of pride and terror that his little girl had grown into one of the most formidable women he'd ever met. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise to be smart," she said, "which sometimes means being careful, and sometimes means taking risks that careful people wouldn't take." Mendoza appeared in the doorway, dressed in the formal attire of a Spanish gentleman. "It is time, señorita. The council will convene in 1 hour."
They made their way through the foggy streets toward the courthouse, an imposing brick building that dominated the town square. Jack could see armed men positioned at various points around the plaza, too many to be casual guards, clearly placed to control any situation that might develop. "Remember," Mendoza murmured as they approached the courthouse steps, "you are not asking for their mercy. You are claiming what is rightfully yours." Grace nodded, then surprised Jack by reaching for his hand. "Thank you, Papa, for everything." "Grace, whatever happens in there, I want you to know that you gave me the best childhood any girl could have asked for. You made me strong enough for this moment." Before Jack could respond, she released his hand and walked up the courthouse steps. The guards, clearly expecting some frightened refugee, were visibly taken aback by her commanding presence. She swept past them as if they were servants, leaving them scrambling to catch up. The courtroom was packed with spectators, ranchers, townspeople, and men whose expensive clothes and cold eyes marked them as the enemies Mendoza had described. At the front of the room sat Judge Harrington, a thin man with a carefully trimmed beard and the look of someone who had grown comfortable with corruption. "This hearing will come to order," the judge announced. "We are here to consider appeals for clemency in the matter of Carlos Vasquez Montalvo, convicted of cattle rustling and murder, scheduled for execution in 3 days. Grace stood in the back of the courtroom, and Jack could see heads turning as people noticed her. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, old-timers who remembered Maria Vasquez Montalvo and saw her daughter's resemblance. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I wish to address the court." Judge Harrington looked up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Young lady, this is not a public forum. Unless you have legal standing in this matter." "I do." Grace began walking down the center aisle, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. "I am Esperanza Alejandra Vasquez Montalvo, daughter of Maria Vasquez Montalvo and granddaughter of Carlos Vasquez Montalvo. I have come to claim my inheritance and demand justice for my family." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Jack saw Sheriff Morrison's hand move to his gun, but several townspeople had stepped into the aisles as if forming a protective barrier around Grace. The political calculation was clear. Whatever these corrupt officials had planned, they couldn't simply arrest the Vasquez Montalvo heir in front of half the town. Judge Harrington pounded his gavel. "Order! Young woman, these are serious claims. Do you have proof of your identity?" Grace reached the front of the courtroom and turned to face the crowd. "I have this." She held up the silver pendant so that it caught the light streaming through the windows. "My mother's cross, given to her by Chief Red Cloud when she married my father. I have the crescent birthmark that has marked the Vasquez Montalvo bloodline for 3 generations." She pulled aside her collar to reveal the small mark. "And I have the testimony of Miguel Mendoza, my grandfather's oldest friend and business partner." "Testimony can be bought," Sheriff Morrison called out. "Jewelry can be stolen." Grace smiled, and Jack felt his heart skip a beat at the dangerous expression on her face. "You're absolutely right, Sheriff, which is why I'm prepared to offer additional proof." She turned back to Judge Harrington. "I challenge any man in this room to explain how a simple frontier girl would know that my grandfather keeps his most important papers in a hidden compartment behind the altar of the chapel on his ranch, or how she would know that he lost the little finger of his left hand in a knife fight with a claim jumper in 1847. Or how she would know the location of the silver mine that has been the source of the Vasquez Montalvo fortune for 30 years, information that my grandfather has shared with no living person except his direct heir." The courtroom fell silent. Jack could see the calculation in Judge Harrington's eyes, the growing realization that this was not the simple intimidation they had planned for. "Your Honor," a new voice called from the back of the courtroom. Jack turned to see an elderly Mexican man leaning heavily on a walking stick. I am Father Martinez. I performed the baptism for Maria Vasquez Montalvo 28 years ago, and I married her to Joseph Standing Bear against her father's wishes. This young woman bears Maria's face so exactly that I would swear she was Maria herself, returned from the dead. More voices began to speak up. Ranchers who had done business with Don Carlos, townspeople who remembered the family's generosity, even some of the Mexican workers who had drifted into town looking for work. Jack realized that Grace had not just proven her identity, she had rallied the community that still remembered what the Vasquez Montalvo name had once meant. Judge Harrington was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. He could not deny Grace's claim without losing all credibility, but acknowledging it would destroy the careful plans of his backers. "Very well," he said finally. "Assuming your identity can be verified, what exactly are you asking this court to do?" Grace's answer came without hesitation. "I am asking you to release my grandfather immediately and return all property seized from our family. And I am asking you to investigate the men who have used false charges and corrupt officials to steal what belongs to us." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Your Honor, this girl may be who she claims, but that doesn't change the evidence against the old man. He was caught red-handed with stolen cattle. Cattle that were stolen from our own herds and planted on our land by your men," Grace replied calmly. "Cattle that bear the Vasquez Montalvo brand altered with a running iron, something any competent investigation would have discovered if anyone had bothered to look." Jack watched the faces around the courtroom and saw the moment when the balance shifted. Too many people had suspected the truth, and Grace's confident knowledge of details she couldn't have known unless she was truly who she claimed had tipped the scales. Judge Harrington looked around the packed courtroom, clearly aware that his next decision would determine whether he maintained even the pretense of legitimate authority. Finally, he spoke. "This court will recess to consider these developments. Carlos Vasquez Montalvo will remain in custody pending further investigation of the evidence presented today." "That's not good enough." Grace's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. "My grandfather is 73 years old and in failing health. Every day he spends in that jail brings him closer to death, which I suspect was the point. I demand his immediate release on bond, with myself as guarantor." "Young lady, you hardly seem in a position to guarantee." "I can guarantee a bond of $50,000 in silver to be paid from the Vasquez Montalvo accounts in San Francisco." Grace's voice carried absolute confidence. "Unless, of course, this court lacks the authority to grant bail to a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong people." The challenge was clear, and Jack saw Judge Harrington realize that he had been outmaneuvered. In front of half the town, he could not refuse such a request without admitting that the proceedings were a sham. "Bond is set at $50,000. The defendant will be released into the custody of—" He paused, clearly reluctant to legitimize Grace's claim any further. "Esperanza Vasquez Montalvo," Grace said firmly, "his granddaughter and legal heir." As the crowd began to file out of the courtroom, Jack felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sheriff Morrison, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. "This ain't over, Mountain Man. That girl may have fooled these people, but there's more than one way to solve a problem." Jack looked down at the smaller man with the calm confidence of someone who had faced down charging bears and survived 3 avalanches. "Sheriff, if you or any of your boys lay a hand on my daughter, you'll learn why they call these mountains home to wolves and wildcats, some predators you just don't want to corner." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he realized that half the courtroom was still watching. With a muttered curse, he pushed past Jack and stalked out of the building. Part 3 unfolded with the inexorable force of a winter avalanche. Within hours of Grace's appearance at the courthouse, the dynamics of Monterey had shifted dramatically. Word spread through the Mexican community like wildfire. The lost heir had returned, the old bloodline was restored, and the family that had once been the backbone of California's Spanish heritage was reclaiming its rightful place. Don Carlos emerged from his cell like a man returning from the grave. 17 years of grief and guilt had aged him beyond his years. But when he first saw Grace standing in the jail's receiving room, the decades seemed to fall away. "Esperanza," the old man whispered, and Grace stepped forward into his arms. "Abuelo," she replied, using the Spanish word with a naturalness that surprised Jack. In that moment, he saw the completion of something that had been broken long before he'd found a crying baby in a hollow tree. But there was little time for reunions. As they rode toward the Vasquez Montalvo ranch in a procession that grew larger with each mile, Mendoza briefed them on the realities they faced. "Morrison and his backers will not accept this," he said quietly. "They have too much invested, too much to lose. They will try to destroy the evidence, intimidate the witnesses, perhaps even stage an accident that removes both you and Don Carlos from their path." The ranch itself was a revelation that left even Jack impressed. Spread across a valley that stretched to the distant hills, it encompassed more land than some entire counties back east. The main house was a Spanish colonial mansion that spoke of generations of wealth and power, surrounded by outbuildings, workshops, and quarters for the dozens of workers who kept the operation running. But Jack's experienced eye could see the signs of systematic sabotage. Fences had been cut and poorly repaired. Water rights had been challenged through legal harassment. And many of the best grazing areas had been rendered useless through carefully orchestrated accidents that contaminated streams and destroyed grassland. "They've been bleeding us slowly," Don Carlos explained as they toured the property. "Every year, a little more pressure, a few more problems. They knew that eventually I would either sell or die, and they were prepared for both possibilities." Grace listened with the intensity she'd once brought to learning woodland survival, absorbing the complex web of water rights, land grants, and political connections that defined power in California. But Jack could see her making calculations of her own, drawing on lessons learned in the Oregon wilderness where survival often depended on reading your enemies correctly. "They made one mistake," she said finally. "They assumed you were alone." That evening, as Grace met with the workers and neighbors who had remained loyal to the family name, Jack found himself in conversation with Don Carlos on the mansion's wide veranda. The old man was clearly struggling with the magnitude of what had been lost and found. "She is remarkable," Don Carlos said, watching Grace move through the crowd below with natural authority. "In her, I see my daughter Maria, but also something more, something harder." "That's the frontier in her," Jack replied. "The mountains don't care about your bloodline or your bank account. They judge you by what you can do, what you can endure. Grace learned those lessons early. You raised her well, Senor Sullivan, better than I raised my own daughter." Jack studied the man who had unknowingly shared his granddaughter's love for 16 years. "You made mistakes, but that don't mean you can't do better now." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A group of riders was coming up the main road, their torches creating a ribbon of light in the darkness. As they drew closer, Jack could see Sheriff Morrison at their head, accompanied by a dozen men who wore badges but carried themselves like hired guns. Grace appeared at Jack's shoulder with a speed that reminded him of her childhood ability to move silently through the forest. "How many?" she asked quietly. 13, Jack replied, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Too many for a social call." "And not enough for what they're probably planning," Grace said with grim satisfaction. "Look at the main house windows." Jack looked and saw what she meant. Throughout the mansion, lights were appearing as loyal workers took positions with rifles. The procession that had brought them to the ranch had not dispersed, it had transformed into a defensive force. Sheriff Morrison reined up at the edge of the torchlight, clearly surprised by the show of strength. "Don Carlos Vasquez Montalvo," he called. "By order of Judge Harrington, you are under arrest for violating the terms of your bail." Grace stepped into the light, her white dress making her clearly visible. "What violation, Sheriff?" "Conspiracy to intimidate witnesses and obstruct justice. We have reports that you've been threatening people who testified against your grandfather." "Interesting," Grace replied calmly. "Since I've spent the entire evening here in the presence of 36 witnesses. Perhaps you'd like to name these people who claim to have been threatened." Morrison's hesitation was telling. Jack realized this was a fishing expedition, an attempt to create justification for the violence that was sure to follow. "Furthermore," Grace continued, "I should point out that as of this afternoon, this property is under the protection of federal law. I've sent telegrams to both the territorial governor and the army post at Fort Monterey, informing them of the systematic corruption in this county. Any attempt to arrest my grandfather without proper evidence will be considered an act of rebellion against federal authority." Jack had to admire the bluff. Even if Grace had sent such telegrams, there was no way any response could have arrived so quickly. But Morrison didn't know that, and the mention of federal intervention clearly rattled him. "You're playing a dangerous game, girl," Morrison said. "There are forces at work here bigger than you understand." "Sheriff," Grace's voice carried a quality Jack had never heard before. Absolute, unshakable authority. "I am the granddaughter of Chief Red Cloud, who held off the United States Army for 6 years. I am the daughter of Joseph Standing Bear, who rode with Crazy Horse at Little Bighorn. And I am the heir to a family that has held this land since before your grandfathers were born. If you think you represent forces bigger than I understand, you are welcome to test that assumption." The standoff stretched through the tense minutes as Morrison weighed his options. Jack could see the calculations in the sheriff's eyes. Too many witnesses, too much attention, too many variables he couldn't control. Finally, Morrison wheeled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he called back as his men followed him into the darkness. "No," Grace said quietly, "it isn't." The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn when the fog was thickest and visibility was at its worst. Jack was awakened by the sound of breaking glass, followed immediately by the acrid smell of smoke. Fire arrows were striking the outbuildings, and armed men were advancing through the fog toward the main house. But Grace had learned more than forest survival during her years in Oregon. She had also learned that the best defense was often a preemptive offense. The attackers found themselves facing not panicked victims, but a coordinated defense that had been planned and prepared. Workers who had seemed to be simple ranch hands revealed themselves as experienced fighters, many of them veterans of various Indian wars and border conflicts. The fog that was supposed to cover the attack also concealed the defenders who had positioned themselves throughout the ranch complex. Jack found himself back-to-back with Don Carlos in the main house, both men armed with rifles and a clear field of fire toward the approaching raiders. But it was Grace who controlled the battle, moving from position to position with messages and orders, coordinating their defense with a tactical skill that would have impressed an army general. "Where did she learn to do this?" Don Carlos asked during a brief lull in the fighting. "Same place she learned everything else," Jack replied, firing at a muzzle flash in the pre-dawn darkness. By watching, listening, and thinking it through. The battle raged for nearly an hour before the attackers began to withdraw. They had expected to overwhelm a small group of surprised victims, not fight a pitched battle against prepared opponents. As the sun began to burn away the fog, Jack could see bodies scattered around the ranch complex, most of them wearing the unofficial uniform of Morrison's hired guns. Sheriff Morrison himself was found wounded and hiding in one of the burned-out buildings, his authority finally revealed as nothing more than a facade for organized theft and murder. When the territorial authorities arrived 2 days later, summoned by the telegrams Grace had indeed sent, they found a county completely transformed. Judge Harrington had fled in the night, his corruption exposed by documents that Grace had somehow obtained from his own office. The men who had orchestrated the conspiracy to steal the Vasquez Montalvo lands were either dead, captured, or scattered to distant territories, where their names were already becoming synonymous with failure. "How did you know?" Don Carlos asked his granddaughter as they stood on the veranda, watching the federal marshals conclude their investigation. "How did you know they would attack when they did? How they would come?" Grace smiled, and Jack saw in her expression the same blend of wisdom and innocence that had captivated him when she was a child. "You taught me to read people the same way Papa taught me to read the forest. Desperate men make predictable choices, especially when they think they're running out of time." As the weeks passed and normalcy began to return to the valley, Jack found himself facing a decision he had been dreading since the moment he first heard Grace's story. She belonged here, in this world of vast ranches and complex politics, among people who understood the blood that flowed in her veins. But the frontier had been his life, and he could not imagine himself as a gentleman rancher playing politics in a white mansion. "You're thinking of leaving," Grace said one evening as they sat together on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. "This is your world now," Jack replied. "This is your world now. You've got your real family, your inheritance, responsibilities that matter more than anything an old lumberjack could offer." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light was fading behind the coastal mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same certainty it had held in the courthouse. "Papa, do you remember what you told me when I was 12 and wanted to climb the big Douglas fir behind our cabin?" Jack smiled despite himself. "I told you that just because you could do something didn't mean you should do it without thinking it through first." "And what did I say?" "You said that thinking it through was exactly what you'd been doing, and that the only way to know if you could reach the top was to start climbing." Grace turned to face him, and in the lamplight from the house, Jack could see both the woman she'd become and the little girl he'd raised. "I've been thinking this through for weeks now, Papa, about what I want, what I need, what kind of life would make me happy. And I want you to stay. Not as a guest, not as someone who's visiting until he figures out where he belongs. I want you to stay as my father, my partner in whatever comes next." She gestured toward the vast ranch spread below them. "This place needs someone who understands how to build things that last, how to work with the land instead of just taking from it. It needs someone who knows the difference between power and strength." Jack felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "I don't know much about running a ranch, Grace. I'm a mountain man." "You know about taking care of what matters to you. You know about making hard decisions and living with the consequences. And you know about raising someone to be strong enough to face whatever the world throws at them." She reached over and took his calloused hand in hers. "This ranch has been run by men who thought wealth meant taking as much as possible. Maybe it's time it was run by people who understand that real wealth comes from building something worth passing on." Don Carlos emerged from the house, moving slowly but with increasing strength. The weeks since his release had been kind to him, and Jack could see echoes of the powerful man he had once been. "Senor Sullivan," the old man said, settling into a chair beside them, "Esperanza tells me you are considering returning to Oregon." "I've been thinking about it," Jack admitted. "Then perhaps you will permit an old man to share some thoughts." Don Carlos leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped before him. "I spent 17 years believing that I had lost everything that mattered: my daughter, my granddaughter, my family's future. I convinced myself that I deserved to lose it all because of my pride, my stubborn refusal to accept my daughter's choices." He paused, looking out over the ranch that stretched to the distant hills. "But I was wrong about what I had lost. My daughter chose love over duty, and she died protecting that choice. My granddaughter survived because of the courage and wisdom of a man who understood that family is not about blood alone. It is about commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to put someone else's welfare before your own." Jack felt the weight of those words, the acknowledgement they contained. "You have already proven yourself to be part of this family in every way that matters," Don Carlos continued. "The question is not whether you belong here. The question is whether you will help us build something worthy of the sacrifice your daughter, our daughter, has already made." Over the following months, the transformation of the Vasquez Montalvo Ranch became the talk of Central California. Under Grace's leadership and Jack's practical guidance, the property evolved from a traditional Spanish land grant into something entirely new: a working partnership between the Mexican families who had tended the land for generations, the native workers who understood its rhythms, and the American settlers who brought new technologies and technologies. Jack found himself managing the practical aspects of ranch operations, while Grace navigated the political complexities of California's rapidly changing society. Together, they implemented innovations that increased productivity while preserving the land for future generations. Water rights were negotiated fairly, grazing schedules were planned to prevent overuse, and the ranch became a model for sustainable development that attracted visitors from across the West. But it was Grace's role as a bridge between communities that truly set the ranch apart. Her mixed heritage, Spanish aristocrat, Lakota princess, and American frontier daughter, allowed her to speak with authority to groups that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. When disputes arose between Mexican landowners and American settlers, both sides found themselves willing to accept her mediation. When tensions flared between ranchers and the local native tribes, Grace's connection to Red Cloud's lineage gave her influence that no government official could match. "She's building something that's never existed before," Mendoza observed one evening as he and Jack watched Grace conduct a meeting between representatives of 5 different communities. Not Spanish California, not American California, but something new, a place where different peoples can work together without losing what makes them who they are. Jack nodded, understanding that his daughter had found her true calling. She was not just reclaiming her inheritance, she was creating a legacy that would outlast any single generation. The final test of that legacy came in the fall of 1874, when news arrived that federal investigators were coming to California to examine land ownership throughout the territory. The political changes following the Civil War had created opportunities for speculators to challenge the validity of old Spanish land grants, and many families were facing the loss of properties their ancestors had held for centuries. "They're using the law to accomplish what Morrison and his men couldn't do with violence," Grace told the gathering of ranchers who had come to seek her advice. "If we fight them separately, they'll pick us off one by one, but if we stand together..." The alliance that formed around the Vasquez Montalvo Ranch became a political force that reshaped California's approach to land rights and cultural integration. Grace's combination of legal knowledge, political connections, and moral authority allowed her to forge agreements that protected traditional holdings while accommodating legitimate American expansion. When the federal investigators arrived, they found not the chaos and conflict they had expected, but a series of communities that had already resolved their disputes through negotiation and compromise. The documentation Grace had assembled was so comprehensive, the local support so overwhelming, that the investigation concluded with recommendations for policy changes that strengthened rather than undermined existing land rights. "How did you know they were coming?" Jack asked his daughter as they celebrated the successful conclusion of the investigation. Grace smiled, and Jack saw in her expression the same satisfaction she had shown as a child when she successfully tracked a deer through difficult terrain. "The same way I knew Morrison would attack when he did." Powerful men who feel threatened by change follow predictable patterns. The trick is to change the game before they realize what's happening. As 1875 dawned, Jack Sullivan found himself in a position he could never have imagined when he first heard a baby crying in the Oregon forest. He was the respected co-owner of one of California's most successful ranches, the father of a woman whose influence extended throughout the territory, and the grandfather figure to a growing community of families who had found prosperity through cooperation rather than conflict. But more than that, he had discovered that the love he had felt for an abandoned child had grown into something larger, a sense of purpose that encompassed not just his own family, but the broader family of people who had chosen to build their lives around the principles of fairness, hard work, and mutual respect. On a clear morning in spring, as Jack stood on the veranda watching Grace teach her own adopted children how to ride, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The baby he had found in a hollow tree had indeed revealed her true identity, not just as the heir to a Spanish land grant or the granddaughter of a Lakota chief, but as the architect of a new kind of community where different peoples could find common ground. "No regrets, Papa?" Grace asked, joining him on the veranda as her children played in the courtyard below. Jack looked out over the thriving ranch, the diverse community that had grown around it, and the mountains that rose in the distance like eternal guardians. "No regrets," he said. "Just gratitude for the day I heard a baby crying in the forest and decided to follow the sound." Grace leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they were simply a father and daughter watching the sun rise over the land they had chosen to call home. But in that simple moment lay the foundation of something much larger, a legacy of courage, wisdom, and love that would endure long after the last of the old frontier had passed into memory. The story that had begun with an abandoned child and a lonely lumberjack had become the foundation of a new chapter in the American West, where identity was defined not by blood alone, but by the choices people made and the communities they chose to build together.